morning, everybody. Can anyone guess what emotion we're looking at today in our series Inside Out, the Bible and our emotions? Anyone guess what our emotion is? Sadness. Yes, Jesus is, I think it's such a beautiful portrayal of that, isn't it? Jesus is obviously very sad, as is Mary and Martha. It's quite a moving scene. And we'll come back to that story soon. But before we do, I thought we would just have a look first, or have a little chat about what sadness is. Last week Ken looked at anger, the little red guy in the middle, and today we're looking at sadness, this is from the movie Inside Out, if you've seen it. Sadness is the little blue lady down on the ground. She's just my favourite. She's amazing. But sadness is an emotion. It's a painful emotion. And sadness is painful because it has something to do with loss. We've lost something or someone that is really important to us, and so we feel very sad about that. And it's a painful emotion, but it's part of what it means to be human, because we all have bad days sometimes. We all feel sad at some point in our lives. I will say here that just need to clarify that sadness and depression or hopelessness are distinct. They're different. So sadness is there for a reason. When we're sad, we can identify why we're sad. Something's happened, like we've lost someone, we've lost something, we've had a difficult conversation with somebody that hasn't gone our way. Whereas depression is a medical disorder, and it impacts the way that we see the whole world. Sometimes people can feel depressed and there's no real reason for it, you just feel depressed. It's a mental health issue, it's a medical disorder that we need professional help for. Whereas sadness, although sometimes if the loss has been great, it can take a long time, but sadness is something that usually doesn't last forever. It comes and goes. Whereas depression untreated generally doesn't go away. We need help with that. So just to clarify that it's different. Sadness and depression are different. The second thing is that sadness is normal. It's very normal and it's valid. Everyone deals with loss and tragedy. Sorry, I've just gone through. I missed my first point, went straight to the second point. So, yeah, I've covered that it's normal and it's valid and it's different from depression. The problem we have with sadness is, even as much as it's valid, it's normal, it's part of what it is to be human, the problem we have with it is that we don't like pain, do we? It's painful and we don't like to feel that pain. In fact, we like it to be the opposite. We like the feeling of what it is to be happy. And in the movie Inside Out, there's a character, Ken referred to her last week, Joy. And Joy is all about trying to keep the little girl in the movie, so all of these emotions are trying to take care of Riley and help her to mature and grow up. And Joy spends a whole time trying to keep sadness away. She's trying to make Riley be happy in the movie. And so it is with us that we prefer joy, we prefer happiness, we don't like to feel the pain of sadness. And that goes right back often into our childhood. Perhaps, we've had a childhood where we weren't, sadness was not affirmed, we weren't allowed to be sad. Perhaps our parents said to us, no, you're okay, don't cry. We were told not to cry, or perhaps we didn't feel we could cry because everyone else was crumbling around, and so we've pushed it down, we've pushed sadness down in our lives. I also think the pressure of social media, right? When we're looking on social media, everyone else looks happy. They're having their best life, they're posting their best photos, and so we just don't live in a world that kind of celebrates sadness and helps us to deal with that in a healthy way. And so we push that all down, and the pressure to be happy and cheerful can actually become quite detrimental to us. I think Ken mentioned it last week. This idea that things that are pushed down, things that are kept in the dark, behave badly in our lives. And we begin, if we push this down, if we push down the sadness or the loss that we go through, then it begins to affect us. We begin to develop problems in our lives. We push it down and we think it's okay and we pretend to be happy, but actually underneath, we're not doing okay. And it begins to affect the way that we behave, it begins to affect the way we live. We can find it hard to sleep, we can, our behaviours change, we can have all sorts of addictions and things happen. And like good Pentecostals, we're often told not to be sad. I remember, anyone that was saved in the 80s, you weren't allowed to confess you were sick, you weren't allowed, no, don't speak that over yourself, I'm the head, not the tail, Jesus is above, he's not beneath. And we would just talk ourselves into be happy. Everyone, Pentecostals, we're really good at that. But actually, it's not really good for us. And many philosophers, people who think deeply about life, actually say that in order to be happy, we need to allow ourselves to be sad. Because if we don't understand what sadness is, we can't really understand what happiness is, and vice versa. In the movie Inside Out, the writer of the movie realised that this character of sadness was going to be really important in Riley's growth and development, the little girl in the movie. I don't know if you haven't seen it yet. We took forever to see it and only watched it a couple of weeks ago, but I so recommend it. And the second one is amazing too. So in the movie, sadness is really, a key part of the movie. And so it is that sadness is really a key part in our lives. So if we go back to the clip that we had a look at to start with, which is Jesus, and it's just before he raises Lazarus from the dead. Just a bit of background on that Jesus, it's near the end of his life. Jesus, the Jewish leaders were after him, and he knew it was almost his time, but not quite his time. So he needed to protect himself. He went off and lived, it says that he lived beyond the Jordan where John the Baptist used to live and his ministry was. So Jesus was there in safety with his disciples, and he received a message from his very good friends Mary and Martha, who were the sisters that we saw in the video, that their brother Lazarus, and it says in the passage in John chapter 11, you can read the story, pretty much the whole chapter, Lazarus, the one you love, is sick. And so Bethany, from where Jesus was, where Lazarus lived, was about 20 miles. So basically a day's walk. So Jesus, if he'd started then, he would have got there within the day. But Jesus interestingly, he chose not to go. He decided that he would stay, and he told his disciples, Lazarus' sickness won't end in death. And so I'm sure the disciples were feeling, okay, cool, Jesus knows Lazarus is going to be okay, we'll just get on with doing what we're doing. But then 2 days later, Jesus announces to the disciples that now we're going to see Lazarus. And then they were very concerned. They're saying, well, it's not safe for you there, and we shouldn't be going. If Lazarus is going to be okay, he'll be okay. And Jesus began then with this very sort of cryptic dialogue with them about walking in the light, and Lazarus needed to be woken up. He was sleeping, and Jesus often spoke quite cryptically to his disciples. And most of the time they didn't get it, and they didn't get it. They couldn't understand. So he said it really plainly to them. He just said to them, guys, Lazarus is dead. And I'm glad for your sakes that I wasn't there so that you may believe. So they go, okay. So off they set to Bethany, to where Lazarus is. And they arrived, so it was a day until the message got to him. They waited 2 days and they went on the fourth. They basically arrived back there on the third day. Is that right? Anyway. Basically, Martha comes and meets Jesus, and they find out that Lazarus has actually been dead for 4 days, which is interesting, which, when you do your maths on it, anybody that's better at maths than me will work out that Lazarus was probably dead when Jesus received the message. He was already dead, which is quite interesting. So Martha came to Jesus. She heard Jesus was coming. She came grief-stricken. She threw herself down at him. She said, If you'd been here, Lord, my brother would not have died. And then Jesus and her go on to have another very interesting conversation about Lazarus' resurrection and Jesus and being in the light, and Jesus was the resurrection, which is so important to our theology and our understanding of who Jesus is. But for today's sermon, we don't need to go into all of that. So after this conversation, Jesus says to Martha, go get Mary. Where's Mary? Her sister. And that's the point that we saw the movie starting from, which was Mary coming to Jesus. And as we saw, Mary is distraught as she's coming to Jesus, and she throws herself down, and she says pretty much the same as her sister says, where were you, Lord? If you were here, my brother would not have died. And she's beside herself. Not only was she there were a whole group of Jewish people who'd been at the house supporting her, and they came too. And the passage tells us that Jesus, he looked at them as we saw, and he looked at Mary and Martha, and he could see the pain that they were feeling. And then beyond that, he looked at the crowd of people coming, and he could see the pain that they were feeling. And the Bible says Jesus was moved. He was moved in his heart. And this is really interesting because Jesus already knew, and he told his disciples that he was going to come and raise Lazarus from the dead, right? So Jesus knew it was going to be okay. And yet, he was sobbing, as we saw, really deeply moved, deeply shaken by it all. And we wonder why that was. Why was it then that Jesus knew what he was going to do, so he wasn't happy about that coming? He was, okay, it's okay, come on, we're going to heal him. Jesus was really moved by it. And I think it tells us so much about God and suffering, or God and sadness, and how God is, how God feels. I think perhaps it was a number of things, perhaps just seeing the impact of death on his close friends. You know, when we watch a sad movie, or you're at a funeral and others are weeping, and you're just moved by their sadness, you're moved by what other people are going through. And Jesus was clearly moved by Mary and Martha, and not only them, the Jewish people that were weeping around. Jesus was moved by them, even though he knew he was going to heal Lazarus. He knew, I think Jesus was probably very moved. Again, he was almost ready to go to the cross. And here he is looking at all of these people. Most of them didn't believe that he was the Son of God. Most of them didn't believe that this big thing he was going to do, actually, that was for them. And I think he was probably very moved by that. I'm sure Jesus was moved knowing that he was on his way to the cross, where he was going to take on that full weight of death for people. And when you think about it, that's a lot to hold, isn't it? When it's getting to the pointy end and he's realising, I'm just days away from taking all of this weight on, and looking at the impact of death for these people and the weight of that on him. And so I think Jesus' response was the most appropriate response that anyone could have in a situation like that. And that is to just crumble under the weight of it. And it's so beautiful to see the character who came to him is in the movie. I haven't seen that scene yet, but Mars says that that's Mary, that's his mother, and you could just see that knowing look, that she understood what was ahead of him. Of course, it goes on, and we read not too much longer in Jesus, just days, weeks away. Jesus then goes to the Garden of Gethsemane. And the same thing happens, doesn't it? That weight of what Jesus was about to go through, the sadness and all of the emotions in that. And Jesus tells his disciples, he says, this sorrow is crushing me. The weight and the pain and the sadness of what I'm going to go through is actually crushing me. I mean, for Jesus to say that, there was just such deep emotion. And interestingly, all he needed was for his disciples to be with him. He just wanted them to be there at that time with him, which they found very hard to do. So we see that Jesus was very comfortable with sadness. He was okay with it. He understood it. It was very much a part of who he was. He's not the only one. The whole Bible, I feel like if I had a bucket and I dropped 2 marbles in with those 2 stories, I could fill the bucket with stories from the Bible about sadness and people's experience of sadness. The Bible embraces it so much. In Psalms, they're filled with examples of men who are going all different emotions, but sadness, really sad, crying out to God, accusing God, a lot of sadness. Job is a story of a very good man who experienced extreme loss and sadness, and he learned so much about God in the process. Isaiah 53, 4 and 5, which was a prophecy about Jesus given hundreds of years before he was born, described Jesus. Now, Jesus was a joyful person, he was a happy person, he had the whole gamut of emotions. But interestingly, Isaiah describes him as a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. And not only that, surely he bore our grief and our sorrow. Matthew 5:4, which is Jesus' own teaching. Remember the Beatitudes, the most beautiful teaching ever, says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." So again, this value on sadness. Romans, Paul's teaching. Paul says, "Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep." And then some more of Paul's teaching, just as a final verse. I could have picked a bucket full, but just grab these ones. It says, "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God." So there's this kind of paying forward, isn't it? The Bible says that we can come to God in our sadness and he'll comfort us, and then out of that we can comfort each other. So this embracing of sadness and the impact that we can have with each other. Ken mentioned a lot with anger, a guy called Tim Keller, who many people know and love, beautiful minister and theologian who's recently died. And he says it's really important for us to see God not just as a happy God, but as a God who created us in his image with sadness and embraces sadness, and that Jesus was sad. It's really important that we know that, because if we do, then when we're sad, we won't feel guilty about it. You know, I think as Christians it's so easy to just feel guilty. We shouldn't be sad. We shouldn't kind of sit with this stuff, or to think that God's judging us because we're going through something. It's important that we will remember then, like we saw this video, that Jesus was moved by our sadness. And it is, when we're going through things, God is moved by your sadness and what you're going through. To remember that there's purpose in your sadness. You know, Mars said something interesting in our Connect group. Jesus loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus. He was going to heal him, and yet he made them wait 4 days for that miracle. Sometimes in our sadness, we don't understand it, but there's purpose in it. And God will bring that purpose out along the line. We've got to trust him. We've got to hold on with that, but there's often a real purpose in it. And the last thing is that if we know that God, Maxie, he's a boy who embraces sadness. Yeah, he's a good guy. Lastly, we can comfort others with the comfort that we've received from the Lord. If we know that God's in it, we can comfort people with that comfort, because we understand that our God is a God who comforts us in our sadness. So just as we begin to bring this to a close, just to recap again the important things and what can help us to have a helpful response to sadness in our life. Firstly, remember, as I said before, that sadness is painful. It is a painful emotion, and it's okay to sit with that. It's okay to sit with that pain and to be with that pain, and to allow others, for those rescuers like me, to allow people, it's okay for people to sit with pain because it's doing a good work in their life. Secondly, that sadness is normal and valid. It's very normal and it's very important in our lives. And thirdly, the last point is that sadness is transformative. It does a work in our lives like nothing else can. I don't know if anyone knows the artist Nick Cave. Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds? Yeah. Deanne sent me an article. She knew we were looking at sadness today. It was an excellent article. And in there they quote Nick Cave, and I didn't realise this, but Nick Cave has lost 2 of his boys, 2 children. One at the age of 15 took drugs for the first time and died once and died. And the second one, I think, had mental health, like a significant mental health disorder, and he died as well. And so Nick Cave has experienced a lot of grief. And he said this quote, which I've put up on the screen: "The person who is grieving is the closest they will ever be to the fundamental essence of things. There is a transformative aspect to this place of suffering." So in other words, the essence, who we really are, when we're sad, we're actually closest to who we really are. And the things that don't matter get stripped away, and we actually, if we can sit with it, it reveals something so deep about who we are. It's such a, and it transforms us in the process. So it's pretty amazing. And there was another quote in that article that I don't think it was his, but I thought this was really, really powerful as well. It says, "The sweetness of bittersweet," the article's called Bittersweet, "is that when our pain encounters others, it's transformed into a powerful force for connection." So what that's actually saying is that beyond our own pain, our pain doesn't work in our life, but when we can sit with each other in pain, that actually there's another amazing thing that's happened, and that is that there's a deep connection that happens between us. So it doesn't work in us, and it doesn't work in us with others, which is such an incredible. And I know when I read that, I thought, yeah, that's so true. When you go through something deep with someone, it forges a depth of relationship that actually connects you in a much deeper way and a powerful way for the rest of your lives. In the movie, there's this really powerful scene of Inside Out. And here we see Sadness, and she's sitting with Bing Bong, who Bing Bong is Riley's little imaginary friend. And Bing Bong is coming to the realisation that Riley doesn't need him anymore. And so all of the things that have connected him to Riley are being broken and thrown away. And he's sitting there really sadly, dejected, and Sadness comes up to him and just sits down beside him, very simply, and just begins to empathise with him, begins to just say, I'm so sorry that you've lost those things that were important. And Bing Bong begins to speak, and they just share for a very short time. It's not rocket science, it's very simple. And you can't see, but Joy is in the background trying to make him happy and trying to, get sadness away. And then she suddenly, you see this look of realisation comes over as she realises that Sadness is doing something amazing. And afterwards she comes up to Sadness and she says, "How did you do that? That was amazing." And Sadness says, I don't know. He just started talking and I just listened. And you know what? I thought, it's simple. Sadness it's not easy, don't get me wrong. Sadness can be hard, and it is hard, and we know it's hard. But it's quite simple, really. Sadness doesn't have all the answers. Sadness doesn't try to have all the answers. Sadness is just happy to sit and to listen to what's actually really going on. Sadness is happy just to allow others to talk. And yet it does this amazing work in our lives. And I wonder what it would be like for us individually, for those of us who maybe have never let sadness, have never valued it, have never allowed it to kind of have its place in our lives. I wonder what it would look like for us to begin to allow sadness to sit sometimes, and allow sadness to just listen to what it's saying to us. And beyond that, as a congregation, to be able to allow people, Pentecostals we are, but To know that God's got it. And actually I was going to get another slide of, you can Google God sitting with people. I was going to do that. But instead of that, I'm going to do something else which is really more, I think, more powerful. And that is that just as we begin to close the service, as we close, just to allow each of us to sit for a moment and close our eyes if you feel you can. And just to think about your own experience in life. I don't know, maybe there are things you're going through at the moment. You go, yeah, I can identify. I'm really feeling sad about that. Maybe it's a broken relationship. Maybe it's a missed opportunity. Maybe it's something hurtful that's been said to you. But there's a sense of real sadness, of loss. And I just invite you just to sit with that. Maybe it's not that at all. Maybe it's just, I don't know, something from way in the past and you think, yeah, I found it really hard to sit with this pain. But what I want us to do, to invite us to do, is to just imagine that God is sitting beside us as He is. Because as we've seen in the Bible, Jesus was moved by sadness. He's moved by your sadness. He's close. He has a purpose in it. But He's right beside you. And without having to have any great answers or reasons or encouragement or joy, to just sit knowing that the things that are making you sad, or the things that have made you sad, or the things that will make you sad, you're not alone in it. Firstly, that His Holy Spirit is with you. And then He's just gonna sit and listen. I think it'd be nice for us. I'm going to be quiet. And just sit for a couple of minutes.